Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the Cold War paper, specifically in reference to the question, explain two consequences of. Now, to understand this question, you need to understand what a consequence is, that being an effect or result. So this happened, and as a result, this happened because of it. Now, this consequence needs to be immediate. It cannot be this happened and 10 years later down the line, this happened with a load of steps in between. It needs to be this happened and immediately after, this was the result. Now, this question is 8 marks, and as a result, you will have 10 minutes split between two paragraphs or two consequences. When you go into the exam, you will see something like this. It will be split clearly on the exam paper to prompt thinking. In the boxes, you need to put one consequence and completely unpack it, and then you move on to the second consequence and unpack that one, making sure that you do put these in two separate boxes completely. Now, when we look at the mark scheme, specifically at the top band, you can see the structure that will be required to make sure that you're hitting everything that is required, so therefore you can get the full marks, that being explain a consequence. I've split that into two parts, and then specific information or good knowledge and understanding of the period. So when you break this down, you need to do number 1, point, address the consequence, number 2, support with evidence, and number 3, explain why it was a consequence. So overall, a very basic structure that I'm sure everyone's familiar with: point, evidence, explain. Now, on this slide, you can see a number of different questions. Feel free to pause it here if you are now looking back over the video and revising. But to quickly explain, the one highlighted in green is the question that I'm going to be answering for you, and the two questions in yellow are going to be planned by me, but ultimately you will need to write them up yourselves if you wish. And these have been broken down into the 3 chapters. So we have the origin of the Cold War and 2 questions relating to this. Chapter 2 being the crises within the Cold War, and then 3 questions relating to this. And then Chapter 3 being the end of the Cold War, and then 3 questions relating to that. So depending on possibly where you are weakest in knowledge, if you're also using this for content revision, perhaps pick a question in the area that you are least comfortable with, because obviously in the exam we don't know what we're going to be faced with. The first question here, these slides will be similar throughout all 3 of the highlighted questions I've done. You have the structure, which is once again point, evidence, explain, and then in italics you can see examples of sentence starters that you could use. In addition, some top tips, such as using words like led to and meant that. This will then focus on the consequence. If you use this kind of language, it will become almost impossible not to address a consequence in that sentence. Make sure you don't over-explain. These are marked separately. It's like 2 4-mark questions, and I'm sure thinking back to Weimar Germany, just how little you need to write for these 4-mark questions. Not a lot. Don't waste your time. And also, every single question that you come up against, all 9 of these questions, for example, one of your consequences could be it increased or it decreased tension. No matter what the question, you can always make the argument that the consequence of whatever it was increased tensions or decreased tensions. And then finally, on the right hand side, a general overview of the Yalta Conference. If we're to remind ourselves once again what it was the second conference towards the end of World War II. It happened in February 1945, and overall in this conference there was kind of a warm fuzzy feeling between Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, as everybody was getting along. It was all very, very nice and good. Now, the 4 things that were agreed: we have Germany being split into 4, we have Berlin being split into 4, we have all countries which would be freed under Nazi Germany have the opportunity to hold democratic elections, but at the same time Stalin was offered a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And then finally Stalin agreed to join the war in Asia once Germany had been defeated. Now, when we're looking at this event and we're looking for 2 things that happened immediately after it that were a consequence of the Yalta Conference, we have one consequence, which is the decision to split Germany into 4. which laid the foundations, which led to clarification between the Allies on the question of what to do with Berlin and Germany. The concessions being made by both the USA and USSR meant that relations or trust was improving. So once again, we can see that there, that one consequence can always be increased or decreased tension. And finally, Stalin being offered spheres of influence led to the installation of satellite states or Soviet satellite states. Now, when we are writing this up, it will look like follows. You give the point. One consequence of the Yalta Conference was that it decreased tensions between superpowers. Then I need to go on and give my evidence. At the Yalta Conference, both the USA and the USSR made concessions to one another to please the other. The USA promised Stalin that he would have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, his main aim for the conference, and the USSR promised Roosevelt that they would join the war in Japan once the war in Europe had come to a close. And then finally, I just need to explain how that is a consequence of the Yalta Conference. So this led to a reduction in tensions, restating the consequence there, because both Stalin and Roosevelt were beginning to realize they could work together and compromise to the benefit of both, meaning that they were both able to greatly benefit from their relationship. So once again, this section in blue, the explain, all going towards justifying why this led to a reduction in tensions. And then if I move on to the second paragraph, at the minute I've only got 4 marks, I need to give that second consequence. It would look something like follows. Another consequence of the Yalta Conference was that it led to clarification surrounding the question of Berlin. At the Yalta Conference, it was agreed that all parties that Germany would be split into 4 zones, shared between the USA, USSR, Britain and France. In addition, Berlin would be split down the same lines despite being found deep within the Soviet zone of Germany itself, that being Germany, not Berlin. This resulted in the first major clear decision surrounding the Germany and Berlin, and as a result allowed the Grand Alliance a level of clarification around the future of Berlin. So once again, just explaining the consequence, that being clarification surrounding the question of Berlin. So once you have done both of these paragraphs in this structure, point, evidence, explain, you should have hopefully been able to gain yourself 8 easy marks and move on to the next question. So I hope this has been useful. If anyone has any question, please comment in the section below and I will aim to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you for listening.